called it Operation Black Snow, though the briefing barely touched on why. My name is Sergeant Alex Hayes, retired Special Forces, and until now I've kept my mouth shut about what really happened during that mission. But I can't carry this alone anymore. It wasn't about national security or secret weapons. It was something else, something we weren't prepared for. The op took us deep into the northern wilderness, somewhere between the Canadian border and nowhere. They flew us in under the cover of night. No coordinates given, just the promise that we'd be extracted once our objective was completed. Our team was tasked with recovering a group of missing scientists, biologists conducting field research on the effects of extreme cold on wildlife. Simple, right? That's what they told us. We landed on a frozen lake, the rotor wash from the Black Hawk stirring up shards of ice like diamond dust. The cold was punishing, even through our gear. The kind of cold that feels alive, like it's clawing into your skin and looking for your bones. Our handler, a stiff-suited man who only introduced himself as Agent Carr, briefed us with the warmth of a glacier. "We've lost contact with the team at Outpost 9, he said. The last transmission was garbled, but it mentioned something about an encounter. Proceed with caution, and Sergeant Hayes..." He turned to me, his pale eyes unblinking. "Stay on mission." The five of us, me, Corporal Jensen, Specialist Ortiz, and the twins, Liam and Nate Ford, set out on snowmobiles, cutting through the endless expanse of white. The landscape was eerily still save for the whine of our engines. No birds, no wind, just silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. It took 2 hours to reach the outpost. From a distance, it looked intact. Solar panels glinting weakly in the fading light, snow piled against the walls. But as we approached, the unease settled in my gut. The place felt wrong. "Where's the welcoming party?" Ortiz muttered, scanning the perimeter with his rifle. I dismounted and signaled for the team to spread out. The outpost was deserted. The door was ajar, swinging listlessly in the wind. Inside, it was chaos. Overturned chairs, shattered monitors, and blood. So much blood. Smears across the walls. Dark stains pooled on the floor, frozen in jagged patterns. "No bodies," Jensen said, his voice tight. "Where the hell are the bodies?" We found the first one an hour later, or what was left of it. Liam radioed in, his voice shaking. "Hayes, you're gonna want to see this." The corpse, or what I assumed had been human, was wedged high in a tree about 50 yards from the outpost. The torso was intact, but the head and limbs were gone, as if something had torn them off and scattered them like scraps. The blood trail in the snow was a crimson roadmap leading nowhere. "What does that?" Ortiz whispered, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "Bear?" Jensen offered weakly. I shook my head. "No bear does this. Stay sharp." As night fell, the forest came alive with noises that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, twigs snapping. Low, guttural growls that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. The kind of sounds that trigger some primal part of your brain, the part that knows when you're being hunted. We set up camp reluctantly, taking shifts to keep watch. The first attack came just after midnight. I was on watch, scanning the tree line through night vision goggles, when I saw it, a shape, tall and gaunt, moving unnaturally fast between the trees. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight like a predator's. "Contact, 10 o'clock, I barked, raising my rifle. The others scrambled to position, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But by the time they trained their lights on it, the thing was gone, leaving only a strange sulfuric smell in its wake. The second attack was worse. It came from above. We'd retreated to the outpost for better cover, boarding up the broken windows and setting up perimeter alarms. Around 3 a.m., the alarms went off. A shrill, piercing wail that sent us scrambling. "What the hell?" Liam started, but his words were cut off by a deafening crash. Something had landed on the roof, heavy enough to buckle the metal. "Upstairs now," I shouted, leading the charge. We burst onto the roof to find Nate, Liam's twin, being dragged toward the edge by a creature that defied explanation. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a face that looked stretched, as if the skin didn't quite fit. Its eyes burned with a cold, malevolent light. "Let him go!" Liam screamed, unloading his rifle into the creature. The rounds hit home, but it didn't bleed. It just turned its gaze on us and let out a sound, a high-pitched, bone-rattling wail that felt like it was drilling into my skull. And then it leaped, taking Nate with it. We didn't sleep after that. By dawn, it was just me, Liam, and Ortiz. Jensen had disappeared during his watch, leaving behind only his rifle and a patch of blood-soaked snow. We were out of options and running low on ammo. "We need to get out of here," Ortiz said, his voice trembling. "Screw the mission." But extraction wasn't coming. Our radios were dead, and the snowmobiles were gone, their tracks leading off into the forest as if they'd been driven away by invisible hands. By the second night, we knew we wouldn't make it. The thing, whatever it was, toyed with us, circling the outpost, its glowing eyes taunting us from the darkness. Liam broke first, sprinting into the trees with a wild scream. I heard his cries echo, then cut off abruptly. Ortiz and I made a pact to hold out until sunrise. We didn't make it that far. Around 4 a.m., the door splintered inward, and the creature stepped inside. Up close, its stench was overpowering, rotting meat and decay. Ortiz opened fire, but it moved too fast, slamming him against the wall with inhuman strength. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. A sharp pain in my leg, the creature's face inches from mine, and the sound of my own screams. When I woke, I was alone in the snow, my leg shattered and my gear stripped. A rescue team found me 2 days later, delirious and frostbitten. They said I was the sole survivor of a failed mission. But I know the truth. They didn't save me. The thing let me go. And sometimes when the wind howls just right, I can still hear it calling my name. They called it Cholla Canyon, though I'd always known it as a graveyard for the reckless. My name is Eric Kane, and back in 2002, I worked for a branch of the U.S. government so obscure it didn't even have a proper name. Unofficially, we called ourselves the Cryptid Containment Division, CCD for short. Our job wasn't to investigate strange sightings or debunk myths. It was to eliminate threats the public wasn't ready to believe existed. That spring, I was sent to a remote stretch of desert in Arizona. The reports were vague. Livestock mutilations, people disappearing, a group of hikers who stumbled out of the canyon with wide, unblinking eyes and refused to speak. Locals whispered about a creature they called El Hombre Coyote, or the Coyote Man, a shapeshifter who could mimic human voices to lure victims. Most dismissed it as folklore, but we didn't. Folklore has a way of being true more often than anyone wants to admit. I was paired with Agent Douglas, a grizzled veteran who'd seen his fair share of things that didn't make the news. "Rule number 1, he said as we bumped along the dirt road toward the canyon. Don't trust what you hear out there. It's never what it seems." The sun was setting by the time we arrived. Cholla Canyon stretched out before us, an endless maze of jagged rock formations and brittle desert brush. The heat clung to the air, even as the sky turned a dusky orange. Our base of operations was an old ranger station, long abandoned and repurposed for missions like this. We set up our equipment, thermal cameras, motion sensors, high-powered rifles loaded with silver-tipped rounds, standard issue for jobs involving shapeshifters or anything with a supernatural bent. By the time night fell, the desert had transformed. The oppressive heat gave way to an eerie stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of dry leaves and the mournful wail of the wind through the canyon. At first, the motion sensors were quiet. Then, around midnight, they started to ping. "Zone 3, Douglas said, his voice low. He tapped the monitor, which showed a heat signature moving slowly through the canyon. It was humanoid, but off. The limbs were too long, the gait too uneven. We grabbed our gear and headed out, navigating the rocky terrain with the aid of night vision goggles. The desert was a labyrinth of shadows, each one seeming to shift and stretch as we passed. Then we heard it. "Help me. Please." The voice was faint, carried on the wind. It sounded like a woman, her tone desperate and raw. I froze, glancing at Douglas. "Rule number 1, he muttered, tightening his grip on his rifle. Help me! The voice came again, closer this time. I scanned the darkness but saw nothing. Eric. This time it was my name. My blood ran cold. How does it know my name? They always know, Douglas said. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Eric, I'm hurt. Please help me. Against every instinct, I took a step toward the sound. What if it's real? What if someone's actually... Douglas grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. It's not real. But then I saw her. A woman crumpled on the ground about 20 yards ahead. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with blood. She reached out weakly, her eyes wide with terror. Help me! I broke free from Douglas and started toward her. Wait! He hissed, but I couldn't ignore her. She looked so human, so fragile. I was 10 feet away when she turned her head. Her face, God, her face wasn't right. Her mouth stretched too wide, her teeth too sharp, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the moon like an animal's. Before I could react, she lunged at me. Douglas fired, the crack of his rifle echoing through the canyon. The silver-tipped bullet hit her square in the chest, and she let out an unearthly screech, her body contorting as if trying to shed its human form. I stumbled backward as the creature collapsed, its skin rippling and changing. Within seconds, it was no longer a woman, but something else. Something that looked like a twisted hybrid of a man and a coyote, its elongated limbs twitching as it let out a final, guttural growl. Now do you believe me? Douglas said, hauling me to my feet. We didn't have time to process what had happened. The motion sensors were going wild, multiple heat signatures converging on our location. Move, Douglas barked, and we sprinted back toward the ranger station. The night was alive with sounds, snarls, growls, and the rhythmic thud of something massive running behind us. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. 3, maybe 4, creatures, their eyes glowing in the dark like embers. We barely made it inside, slamming the door and barricading it with everything we could find. The creatures circled the station, their claws scraping against the walls, their voices mimicking human cries. Eric, let us in. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound. Stay focused, Douglas snapped, shoving a shotgun into my hands. They're trying to break you. The next few hours were a blur of noise and fear. The creatures tested every entry point, their inhuman strength threatening to tear the building apart. We fired through the windows, the silver rounds barely keeping them at bay. By dawn, they were gone, retreating into the canyon as the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon. We radioed for extraction, our voices hoarse and shaky. When the helicopter arrived, the pilot didn't ask questions. They never did. As we lifted off, I looked down at the canyon, its red rocks glowing in the morning light. It seemed peaceful, almost beautiful, but I knew better. Cholla Canyon wasn't a graveyard for the reckless. It was a hunting ground, and we were the prey. I've spent 20 years chasing shadows, but what happened at Black Mesa still haunts me. My name is Neil Harper. Back in 2002, I was part of a small classified unit known simply as Section 6. Our mission? To hunt and eliminate entities the world wasn't ready to accept. It sounds glamorous, but most of the time it was hell, especially that summer in Arizona. We'd been sent to investigate disturbances near Black Mesa, just south of the Navajo Nation. Ranchers in the area reported livestock vanishing, entire herds wiped out overnight without a trace. A few brave souls claimed they'd seen something, a massive shadow moving across the desert, too fast and too quiet to be natural. Officially, we were there to survey environmental impacts. Unofficially, the higher-ups were concerned about a cryptid called the Mesa Ravager. Rumors about it dated back centuries. A subterranean predator, larger than a bear, that tunneled through rock and sand like a mole. Locals believed it was a guardian spirit gone mad. We arrived in the dead of night, a 3-man team. Me, Lieutenant Daniels, our unit leader, and a rookie named Morales. Black Mesa loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette cutting across a sky filled with stars. The air was thick with the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Our base of operations was a weathered shack near an abandoned mining site, its windows boarded up and its walls riddled with bullet holes. Morales made a joke about previous tenants needing better aim, but no one laughed. "Stay sharp," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "We're not alone out here." We started by sweeping the surrounding area, using ground-penetrating radar to look for anomalies. The first night was uneventful, just coyotes howling in the distance and the occasional tumbleweed skittering by. But the second night, everything changed. It started with the vibrations. "Feel that?" Morales whispered, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. I nodded. At first it felt like a small earthquake, subtle but rhythmic, like something massive was moving beneath us. The vibrations grew stronger, and then came the sound. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the desert, so low and resonant it felt like it was coming from the earth itself. "Harper! Morales! On me!" Daniels barked, his rifle at the ready. We followed the sound to a dry riverbed about a mile from the shack. The ground was torn apart, massive gouges carved into the hardened clay. "What the hell?" Morales muttered, kneeling to examine one of the grooves. It was claw marks, 3 parallel trenches, each one deeper than my arm. Before we could process what we were looking at, the vibrations returned, stronger this time. The ground beneath us seemed to shift, and the roar came again closer. "Fall back," Daniels ordered, but it was too late. The earth erupted in front of us, sending dirt and rocks flying. A massive shape burst forth from the ground, a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was nearly 15 feet long, its body covered in jagged armor-like scales that gleamed in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow, and its maw was filled with rows of serrated teeth. But the worst part was the sound, a constant clicking, like the grinding of bones, emanating from somewhere deep within its chest. "Open fire!" Daniels shouted. We unloaded everything we had. Bullets ricocheted off its armored hide, some finding softer spots around its joints and mouth. The creature screeched, a deafening, otherworldly sound, and lunged at us with terrifying speed. It went for Morales first, swatting him aside like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skidding out of reach. "Morales!" I yelled, but there was no time to help him. The creature turned its attention to me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. I dove behind a boulder as it charged, the ground shaking with each step. Daniels flanked it, aiming for the soft tissue beneath its jaw. His shots landed, drawing a spray of dark, viscous blood that hissed and smoked as it hit the ground. "Keep moving," Daniels shouted. "Don't let it pin you down." I scrambled to higher ground, my heart pounding in my chest. From my vantage point, I could see Morales crawling toward his rifle, his movements sluggish. The creature noticed too. It turned, its massive claws gouging the earth as it lunged toward him. "Over here, you ugly bastard," I shouted, firing a burst to draw its attention. It worked. Too well. The creature spun toward me, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose rock. Just as it reared back for the kill, Daniels appeared behind it, tossing a grenade into its open mouth. "Get down!" he roared. The explosion was deafening, a burst of fire and smoke that lit up the night. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting screech before collapsing, its body twitching as it slowly stilled. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Daniels helped me to my feet, his face grim. "You okay?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Morales?" We found him near the edge of the riverbed, alive but barely. His leg was broken, and he was covered in cuts and bruises, but he managed a weak smile. "Did we get it?" Daniels glanced at the creature's smoldering corpse and nodded. "Yeah, we got it." By dawn, the cleanup crew arrived, a team of men in unmarked uniforms who didn't say a word as they loaded the creature's body onto a flatbed truck. They didn't ask us what happened, and we didn't offer details. Before they left, one of them handed Daniels a folder stamped with the words, "Level 5 clearance required." "What's that?" I asked. Daniels shook his head. "Nothing you want to know." We left Black Mesa that afternoon, battered but alive. The official report would later claim we'd encountered a rogue bear and neutralized the threat. But I know the truth. The Mesa Ravager wasn't some rogue predator. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. And I'll never forget the way it looked at me, as if it recognized me, as if it knew I'd be back. They told us the forests of Oregon were beautiful in the spring, but by the time I saw them, beauty was the last thing on my mind. My name is Sam Keller, and for a while I was part of a unit nobody wanted to admit existed. We weren't soldiers or researchers. We were hunters, chasing things that had no business existing. Our latest mission brought us to Cradle Ridge, a remote mountain town surrounded by thick, ancient woods. Locals had been fleeing in droves, leaving behind cryptic warnings about people vanishing in the fog. At first, we thought it was the usual hysteria, campfire stories blown out of proportion. But the higher-ups disagreed, and when they disagreed, we got sent in. It was me, Lieutenant Grayson, and a pair of rookies, Carter and Reed. We arrived just before dusk, the town eerily silent. The streets were empty, windows boarded up, doors swinging open in the breeze. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt forgotten. "This place gives me the creeps," Carter muttered, clutching his rifle a little too tightly. Grayson ignored him, scanning the tree line. "Focus. We're not here to sightsee." We made our way to the town square, where an old church loomed over the empty streets. Its steeple was crooked, leaning like it was tired of standing. Inside, we found a scattering of supplies, maps, journals, even a few loaded rifles. Someone had been here recently, but they were long gone now. "What's this?" Reed asked, picking up a leather-bound journal from a pew. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls, barely legible in the fading light. "The fog comes at night. It whispers. It calls your name. Don't listen. Don't follow." Grayson read the entry aloud, his brow furrowing. Superstitious nonsense. But I wasn't so sure. Night fell quickly in Cradle Ridge, the darkness swallowing the town like a wave. We set up base in the church, lighting lanterns and double-checking our weapons. The air grew heavy, the kind of pressure that makes it hard to breathe. Then the fog rolled in. It started as a faint mist creeping through the trees, weaving between the buildings like a living thing. Within minutes, it thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. "Stay inside," Grayson ordered, his voice firm. "No one goes out there alone." We watched the fog through the cracked windows, our breaths fogging the glass. At first, it was just fog. But then the whispers started. "Reed." It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make him freeze. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "No," Grayson snapped. "And neither did you. Ignore it." But the whispers grew louder. They came from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the air like a song you couldn't quite catch. "Sam." My blood ran cold. Hearing your name in a place like that does something to you. It cuts through your logic, makes you question everything. "They're just echoes," Grayson insisted, though even he looked rattled. "Don't let them get in your head." The first attack came around midnight. We'd barricaded the doors, but the fog didn't care. It seeped through the cracks, curling around the pews like ghostly fingers. Then came the shadows, figures moving within the mist, their forms indistinct but wrong. "Contact!" Carter yelled, firing into the fog. The muzzle flash illuminated the church for a split second, and what I saw will haunt me forever. The figure was humanoid, but barely. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, God, its eyes, glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The creature lunged, its movement unnaturally fluid. Carter went down first, dragged screaming into the mist before we could stop it. "Fall back!" Grayson shouted, firing wildly. We retreated to the second floor, slamming the door behind us. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Sam, come outside, it's safe out here." I gritted my teeth, trying to block it out, but the voice sounded so familiar. It wasn't just calling my name. It sounded like my brother. "They're in your head," Grayson said, his voice tight. "Don't listen. They'll use whatever they can to break you." But Reed didn't listen. "It's my mom," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "She's out there. She's alive." "Reed, no," I shouted, but it was too late. He shoved past me, flinging the door open and disappearing into the fog. We never saw him again. By dawn, it was just me and Grayson. The fog receded with the first light, taking the whispers with it. But the damage was done. Carter and Reed were gone, and the church was smeared with blood and claw marks. "We need to move," Grayson said, his voice hoarse. We gathered what supplies we could and left the church, sticking to the center of the streets where the sunlight was strongest. The fog had retreated to the edges of the town, lingering like a predator waiting for its moment. We didn't make it far. The whispers started again, faint but persistent. This time, they didn't just call our names. They mocked us, mimicking our own voices, our own fears. "Sam, you left them behind." I spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there. "Focus," Grayson barked, dragging me forward. We reached the edge of the forest when the fog surged back, faster than before. The shadows emerged again, circling us like wolves. Grayson fired, taking one down with a well-placed shot to its glowing eyes, but there were too many. "Go!" he shouted, shoving me toward the trees. "Get to the extraction point." I hesitated, but he gave me a look that brooked no argument. "That's an order, Keller. Go." I ran, the whispers chasing me, the sounds of gunfire and screams fading into the distance. I don't know how I made it out of Cradle Ridge. The extraction team found me at the edge of the forest, disoriented and half mad. They didn't ask questions. They never did. The official report claimed the town had been abandoned due to environmental hazards. But I know the truth. The fog wasn't just weather. It was alive. And it's still out there, waiting for the next poor soul to wander too close. Hollow Lake wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. My name is Jack Turner, and for 5 years I worked as part of a classified cryptid response team. When strange things happened in remote places, things the government couldn't explain, we got sent in to clean it up. In the fall of 2004, we were dispatched to a small, nameless logging camp deep in the Rocky Mountains. The report was vague. Loggers disappearing near a body of water they called Hollow Lake. Locals claimed the lake screamed at night, but that was just folklore, or so we thought. We arrived at the camp under heavy rain, the kind that soaks through every layer no matter how prepared you are. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the towering trees blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The camp itself was little more than a collection of wooden shacks, their roofs sagging under the weight of moss and decay. But what caught my attention was the silence. No birds, no insects, just the steady patter of rain. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Our team leader, Captain Wells, wasn't one for superstition. "We'll sweep the lake, figure out what's scaring the locals, and be out by morning," he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. I wasn't so confident. Something about the place felt wrong, like we were being watched. As night fell, we set up a temporary base in one of the sturdier shacks. The rain had stopped, but a thick mist had rolled in, clinging to the ground like a living thing. Around midnight, the screaming started. It wasn't a single voice. It was hundreds, maybe thousands, all wailing in unison. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees and sending shivers down my spine. "What the hell is that?" muttered Davis, our communications officer, his hands trembling as he adjusted the radio. The signal was nothing but static. "Focus!" Wells snapped. "We're here to investigate, not panic." We geared up and headed toward the lake, our flashlights cutting through the mist. The screaming grew louder with each step, a cacophony of agony that seemed to pierce straight into my skull. When we reached the shoreline, the water was eerily still, reflecting the pale moonlight like a sheet of glass. But there was something beneath the surface, shadows, writhing and shifting as if the lake itself was alive. "Thermal readings are off the charts," said Carter, our tech specialist, his voice tight with fear. Something's down there. As if in response, the water began to ripple. Slowly at first, then violently, as if something massive was stirring below. And then we saw it. A hand, human, or at least it looked human, emerged from the depths, followed by another and another. Dozens of hands clawed their way to the surface, attached to elongated, emaciated bodies that glistened like oil in the moonlight. Their faces were featureless, save for gaping mouths that emitted the unearthly screams. "Open fire!" Wells shouted, and we did, unloading everything we had into the creatures. The bullets tore through them, black ichor spraying into the air, but for every one we brought down, 2 more emerged from the water. "They're not stopping!" Davis yelled, his voice cracking. One of the creatures lunged at him, its bony fingers wrapping around his leg. Before anyone could react, it dragged him into the lake, his screams swallowed by the dark waters. "Fall back," Wells ordered. But the creatures were relentless. They moved with unnatural speed, their long limbs propelling them forward like spiders on land. I emptied my rifle into one that came too close, its body collapsing in a heap before disintegrating into a puddle of black sludge. By the time we made it back to the camp, it was just me, Wells, and Carter. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. We barricaded ourselves inside the shack, our breathing heavy and uneven. "What the hell were those things?" Carter whispered, his hands shaking as he reloaded his rifle. "Doesn't matter," Wells said grimly. "We just have to survive until sunrise." But sunrise felt like an eternity away. The mist outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Every so often we'd hear faint whispers, as if the creatures were just outside, waiting for us to let our guard down. Around 3 a.m., the radio crackled to life. At first it was just static, but then a voice came through, soft, almost hypnotic. "Come back to the water, it's safe here." "Turn that off," Wells growled. But Carter was frozen, staring at the radio with wide eyes. "It's my brother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's alive." "Carter, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. He threw open the door and disappeared into the mist. I ran after him, but the fog swallowed him whole. The last thing I heard was his scream, abruptly cut off. I stumbled back into the shack, slamming the door behind me. Wells was already moving, gathering what supplies we had left. "We're not staying," he said. "We make for the evac point now." The journey through the forest was a blur of fear and adrenaline. The mist clung to us, whispering our names, beckoning us back to the lake. I felt it pulling at my mind, tempting me with voices I hadn't heard in years. My mother, my best friend from childhood, all long gone. But Wells kept me grounded, his barked orders cutting through the haze. When we finally reached the evac point, the helicopter was already there, its rotors slicing through the mist. We climbed aboard, collapsing into the seats as the pilot lifted off. From the air, Hollow Lake looked peaceful, the surface calm and unbroken. But I knew better. The official report called it a gas leak, a mass hallucination brought on by toxic exposure. But Wells and I knew the truth. That lake wasn't just a body of water, it was a gateway, and whatever lived beneath it wasn't done with us. To this day, I can't stand the sound of running water. It always feels like the lake is calling me back. And one day, I'm afraid I might answer. They called it a cleanup job, but those of us on the team knew better. My name is Ben Foster, and back in 2010, I was part of a covert unit that dealt with things that didn't belong in our world. Our mission this time took us to Ashford Quarry, a mining site in the Appalachian Mountains that had been abandoned for decades. Workers had vanished there in the 1950s, their bodies never found. Rumors spread about shadowy figures seen in the tunnels, but the mining company blamed it on faulty ventilation and shut the place down. That should have been the end of it. But 2 weeks before we arrived, hikers stumbled onto something near the quarry. 4 bodies, shriveled like they'd been drained of life. Their skin was dry and stretched taut over their bones, their faces frozen in silent screams. Locals started talking about the hollow men again, old legends about figures that lived in the dark and fed on human souls. The government didn't believe in legends, but they sent us anyway. The approach to the quarry was uneventful, just miles of winding forest roads that led to a massive pit carved into the earth. The entrance to the mine loomed ahead, a gaping maw of darkness surrounded by rusted equipment and crumbling buildings. The air smelled stale, a mix of damp earth and decay. Our team consisted of 4. Me, Captain Marshall, a demolitions expert named Carter, and Lynch, the rookie. Marshall led the way, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Stay close and stay alert," he said, his voice steady but tense. "We don't know what we're dealing with." The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels, each one colder and darker than the last. The deeper we went, the stronger the sense of wrongness became. It wasn't just the darkness or the claustrophobia. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of our lights, and every now and then we heard faint whispers echoing through the tunnels. "Anyone else hearing that?" Lynch asked, his voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Marshall replied, though we all knew it wasn't. An hour in, we reached a chamber that made us stop in our tracks. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, jagged, looping shapes that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. "What the hell is this?" Carter muttered, running his fingers over one of the carvings. Marshall didn't answer. He was staring at the center of the chamber, where a pile of bones lay in a crude circle. Human bones. Some were ancient, yellowed with age, but others looked fresh. And then the lights went out. Panic surged as we scrambled to get our gear working. My flashlight flickered back on, illuminating the chamber. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, colder, and the whispers were louder now, almost deafening. "Move!" Marshall barked, and we didn't need to be told twice. As we ran, the whispers turned into screams, high, keening wails that seemed to come from all around us. The shadows moved faster, closing in, and then I saw one. A figure stepped out of the darkness, tall and impossibly thin, its body a mass of writhing black tendrils. Its face, or where its face should have been, was a blank void, featureless and terrifying. Carter fired first, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the tunnel, but the creature didn't fall. It moved like liquid, closing the distance in seconds. Its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Carter's throat and lifting him off the ground. His screams were cut short as his body went limp, the life draining from him in an instant. "Run!" Marshall shouted, and we obeyed, tearing through the tunnels as the creatures pursued us. There were more of them now, their blank faces and twisting forms closing in from all directions. Lynch tripped and fell, his flashlight skittering across the ground. I turned to help him, but Marshall grabbed my arm. "He's gone," he said, his voice grim. I didn't want to believe him, but when I looked back, all I saw was darkness. We reached the surface just as dawn broke, the pale light spilling over the quarry. The creatures stopped at the edge of the tunnel, retreating into the shadows like they couldn't bear the light. We didn't stop running until we were back at the vehicles. Marshall radioed for extraction, his hands shaking as he gave the report. 2 men down. Unknown entities in the tunnels. Area is compromised. The cleanup crew arrived an hour later, their trucks loaded with explosives. They didn't ask us any questions. Their orders were clear: seal the mine, bury whatever was down there, and pretend it never happened. As the charges went off, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air, I felt a hollow sense of relief. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The hollow men weren't just in the mine. They were in the shadows, in the places people didn't go. And they were waiting. Even now, I can't walk into a dark room without feeling like they're there, just beyond the edge of the light. Watching, whispering, waiting for the day the shadows return. I've seen things in my time that would make most people question reality, but nothing like what I encountered at Coldwater Marsh. My name is Henry Graves, and I spent 6 years working for a branch of the government that doesn't officially exist. Our job was to track down and contain anomalies before they became public knowledge. Coldwater was one of those places where the boundary between the natural and unnatural had frayed to the breaking point. We were deployed in late August, just as the summer heat began to fade into the damp chill of autumn. Coldwater Marsh sits in the middle of nowhere, a sprawling expanse of reeds, black water, and suffocating mist. Locals had been reporting strange lights drifting over the water at night, brilliant blue orbs that moved as if they were alive. At first, the stories were dismissed as swamp gas or hallucinations. Then people started disappearing. My team consisted of 3. Myself, Agent Merrick, and Dr. Lena Torres, a biologist specializing in anomalous phenomena. Merrick was the muscle, the kind of guy who could keep his cool even when things got weird. Torres was the brains, always asking questions and taking samples. Me? I was somewhere in between, a field operative with enough experience to know when we were in over our heads. We set up camp on a narrow strip of dry land near the center of the marsh, the only place solid enough to hold our equipment. By day, the marsh was oppressive but manageable. The water was black as ink, the air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation. But it was at night that the place came alive. The first night, the lights appeared just after midnight, faint at first, like distant stars hovering above the water. As they grew brighter, they began to move, drifting closer in a slow, hypnotic dance. They didn't flicker or waver like natural light. They pulsed, almost like they were breathing. "What the hell are those?" Merrick muttered, raising his rifle. "Don't engage," Torres said sharply. She was already taking notes, her eyes wide with fascination. "They're not behaving like anything I've seen before." We watched in silence as the lights moved closer, close enough to reflect off the water and illuminate the reeds. That's when we noticed the shapes. Beneath each orb, just visible beneath the surface, were figures. Human shapes, pale and distorted, their faces turned upward as if staring at the lights. I felt a chill run down my spine. "They're underwater," I whispered, "but they're not moving." Torres adjusted her headlamp and leaned over the edge of the boat. "They're not human. Look at the proportions. The arms are too long, the head's too narrow." Before she could get a closer look, one of the lights shot forward, hovering just inches from her face. She froze, her breath hitching. The orb was mesmerizing, its glow soft and inviting. For a moment it felt like it was trying to communicate, the light pulsing in a rhythm that almost felt deliberate. "Torres, step back," Merrick said, his voice low but urgent. She didn't move. Her hand lifted slowly, reaching toward the light as if drawn by an invisible force. "Torres!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. The moment her hand broke contact with the orb, it emitted a high-pitched whine and shot back toward the water. The other lights began to pulse erratically, their movements faster and more chaotic. "That's enough for tonight," Merrick said, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We're pulling back." The second night was worse. The lights returned, but this time they didn't stay at a distance. They surrounded our camp, their glow reflecting off the water and casting eerie shadows across the trees. The figures beneath them were clearer now, their faces pale and expressionless. I counted at least 10, but I knew there were more. "Something's different," Torres said, her voice tight. "They're closer." One of the lights broke away from the group, hovering near the edge of the camp. Then another, and another. Before we knew it, they were everywhere, circling us like predators sizing up their prey. "Graves," Merrick said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're cutting us off." I grabbed the radio, trying to call for extraction, but all I got was static. The air around us felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The lights pulsed faster, their glow becoming almost blinding. And then they attacked. The lights shot forward in unison, slamming into Merrick with enough force to knock him off his feet. He screamed as the orb closest to him began to pulse violently, its glow seeping into his skin like liquid fire. I raised my rifle and fired, the crack of the shot echoing through the marsh. The orb shattered, releasing a burst of blinding light and a sound like shattering glass. Merrick collapsed, his skin pale and slick with sweat. "They're in my head," he gasped, clutching his temples. "Voices. Too many voices." Torres was already at his side trying to stabilize him, but the lights weren't done. They swarmed around us, their movements frantic and erratic. One of them shot toward Torres, but I fired again, the round slicing through the orb and sending it spinning back into the water. "We have to move," I shouted, grabbing Merrick under the arms and dragging him toward the boat. Torres followed, firing wildly at the remaining lights. The boat engine roared to life as we pushed off, the lights chasing us through the reeds. Their pulsing grew more intense, and the figures beneath them began to rise, their pale hands clawing at the air. The ride back to the extraction point was a blur of panic and adrenaline. The lights followed us the entire way, but they never left the water, their movements slowing as we reached solid ground. By the time the chopper arrived, they had vanished, leaving only the dark, still water behind. Merrick didn't make it. By the time we reached the nearest medical facility, his body was cold and rigid, his skin marked with faint, glowing lines that pulsed faintly before fading away. Torres and I were debriefed, our equipment confiscated, and the official report chalked everything up to environmental anomalies. But I know what we saw. Those lights weren't just phenomena. They were alive, and they were hunting. I still dream about Coldwater Marsh sometimes. In the dreams, the lights find me. Their glow brighter than ever. And no matter how fast I run, they always catch me. There's a reason no one flies over the Black Sky Range anymore. I know because I was there the night it earned its name. My name is Rick Matheson, and I used to run point for a government task force that dealt with aerial anomalies. Most of the time, we were sent to investigate strange radar blips, rogue drones, or the occasional weather phenomenon mistaken for something extraterrestrial. What happened in 2017, though, wasn't in any manual or debriefing. We were dispatched to a remote Air Force base in Wyoming after a patrol aircraft vanished mid-flight. No distress signal, no wreckage, just gone. The last recorded coordinates put the plane somewhere over the Black Sky Range, a jagged expanse of mountains and valleys so desolate even the locals avoided it. The briefing was short and cryptic. We were to join an overnight reconnaissance flight and investigate unusual activity reported in the area. That was it. No specifics, no theories. Just a vague warning to expect the unexpected. Our crew was small. Me, Captain Lewis, a radar tech named Briggs, and a pilot called Harper. We boarded a modified C-130 at dusk, its belly outfitted with high-grade surveillance equipment. As the engines roared to life, I glanced out the window at the range. The peaks loomed like black teeth against the fading light, an ominous silhouette that set my nerves on edge. By the time we reached the coordinates, the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the range into darkness. The only light came from our instruments, casting an eerie green glow inside the cabin. Briggs was hunched over his radar screen, muttering something about interference. "Getting anything?" Lewis asked, leaning over his shoulder. "Not sure," Briggs replied. "It's weird. The signal's bouncing all over the place like there's something down there jamming us." Harper frowned, adjusting his controls. "Altitude's holding steady, but this wind doesn't feel natural. It's like something's pushing us off course." Then the lights appeared. At first, they were faint, like distant stars flickering just above the mountain peaks. But as we watched, they grew brighter, moving in erratic patterns that defied logic. They weren't drones, and they weren't aircraft. They moved too fast, stopping and starting in ways that no human-made machine could replicate. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, my eyes glued to the window. "Lewis, you seeing this?" Harper asked, his voice tight. Before Lewis could respond, the lights shot toward us, closing the distance in seconds. There were 5 of them, each one glowing with a cold, bluish-white light that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. "Evasive maneuvers," Lewis barked, but it was too late. The lights surrounded the plane, their glow seeping into the cabin like liquid moonlight. The instruments went haywire, altimeter spinning, radar screen blank, comms filled with static. Harper fought the controls, but the plane shuddered violently, as if an invisible hand had grabbed hold of it. Then came the sound. It started as a low hum, barely audible, but it quickly grew into a deafening roar that vibrated through my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The noise wasn't just external, it was inside me, resonating in my bones. "Shut it down!" Lewis shouted, though I wasn't sure who he was talking to. The lights pulsed brighter, and for a moment, I thought the plane was going to be torn apart. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. The cabin fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the crew. Harper steadied the plane, his hands shaking as he gripped the controls. "What the hell was that?" Briggs whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," Lewis said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "But we're not sticking around to find out. Get us out of here." As Harper banked the plane away from the range, I glanced out the window and froze. Below us, the mountains were no longer dark. They were glowing. Faint lines of light traced the peaks and valleys, forming intricate patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate. "Are you seeing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Briggs said, his eyes wide. "It's like a map." "Don't look at it," Lewis snapped. "Focus on getting home." We reached the base just before dawn, our nerves frayed and our equipment fried. The debriefing was brief and unsatisfying. The brass dismissed the incident as electromagnetic interference and classified the mission under the highest level of secrecy. We were ordered not to speak of it again. But I can't forget. I've flown over a lot of places, but the Black Sky Range was different. Those lights weren't just anomalies. They were alive, and they were watching us. Every so often I dream about that night. In the dream, the lights don't disappear. They pull the plane down, dragging us into the glowing mountains. I always wake up just before we hit the ground, but the hum, the awful, bone-deep hum, lingers long after I open my eyes.